Hi, I'm Bo with Washington Territory History Project. And what you're about to watch actually happened. Not a lot of people realize that Washington Territory was actually born in violence and warfare, much less naval battles. There were actually two. And this is a story about one of them. The Indian Wars of 1855 to 1858 that occurred here in the Pacific Northwest are easily overlooked in American history. Not many people lived here at the time, and the Civil War just 3 years later eclipsed what happened out here and erased it from the national consciousness. They were really not a single war, but more two closely related but mostly separate conflicts called the Puget Sound War and the Yakima War. By 1857, the conflict on the west side of the Cascades was largely over. Chief Leschi had been captured in November of 1856, and just days later, his brother, Quiamuth, had turned himself in to the governor, only to be murdered later that night as he slept in the governor's home. His murderers were never conclusively identified or charged. But just 2 days after the killing of Quiamuth occurred was the Battle of Port Gamble, on November 21st, 1856. The belligerents involved in this affair were described as a northern tribe and the United States Navy. Despite the timing and location of this event, and that it was between the natives and the American military, it was not a part of the Puget Sound War, at least not directly. The broader Indian Wars were battles fought primarily over treaty terms, with Chief Leschi and his brother organizing the Nisqually and other bands together and attacking Governor Stevens' territorial armies and settlements west of the mountains. And on the east side of the Cascades, a confederation of tribes under the great war chief Kamiakin, and perhaps the greatest warrior of all, Qualchan, who was the son of hereditary Yakima chief Auhai, were engaging primarily against the United States Army. That part of the war wouldn't end until late 1858. But what happened at Port Gamble in November of 1856 was different. These northern Indians were neither Puget Sound Salish nor one of the Sahaptian-speaking eastern tribes. They came from hundreds of miles to the north, from either southeast Alaska or coastal Canada. Although this battle with them had nothing to do with treaties with Washington tribes, their presence in Washington waters in the first place is perhaps a key reason why the relatively few Americans present in the Puget Sound region were able to hold out and eventually survive against Leschi's superior numbers. Long before the arrival of Americans and even the Europeans, northern tribes from coastal Canada and Alaska would frequently attack the Salish tribes living on Puget Sound, raiding their villages, killing the males and taking women and children as prisoners, war brides and slaves, back to their homeland. These First Nations people spoke different languages, had different traditions and customs compared to the Puget Sound tribes. They were accomplished seafarers, arriving in fleets of fast dugout canoes, some so large they could carry as many as 50 warriors apiece. They were aggressive and technologically superior in almost every way, especially in warfare, and attempting to negotiate with them was a pointless exercise. They didn't paddle hundreds of miles to talk. When the European trappers and traders began arriving and interacting with local tribes, they provided them with muskets, which improved their chances in resisting the northern tribe raids significantly, but still not completely. And the raids continued and was one of the most vexing problems facing local tribal leaders. When the Americans came, many of the tribes saw their presence as a bulwark against future invasions from the north. The Americans brought with them more guns and more able-bodied men to defend the entire region. They brought howitzers and even powerful ocean-going ships with large cannons. This was one of the primary reasons the most powerful of the Puget Sound tribes, the Snoqualmie, led by their enigmatic chief Pat Canham, rebuked Leshai's overtures in 1856 and decided against joining in the fight against the Americans. Pat Canham detested the American incursion and had no love for the settlers or their leaders. But he was a forward and pragmatic thinker, and apparently saw a better future and hope for peace, not just by sitting out the fight and remaining neutral, but in taking up arms against the Confederated tribes under Leshai. Allying with the Americans would mean a stop to the attacks by the northern tribes, and to the Americans, few in number, this alliance quite possibly was the key to avoiding being wiped out completely. Early in 1856, a war party from the north with as many as 300 warriors and several fast canoes was spotted in South Puget Sound near Steilacoom, likely getting ready to conduct an attack on local tribes. But the presence of the U.S. Navy sloop of war, the USS Decatur, possibly deterred them, especially after the Decatur's large guns and a detachment of Marines had repelled an attack by Leshai's forces on the fledgling town of Seattle on January the 26th. After that attack, another warship was dispatched from San Francisco to bring much-needed supplies, including guns and powder, and aid in patrolling Washington waters in defense of the people. This was the steam and sail-powered sloop of war gunship, the USS Massachusetts. In November of 1856, urgent word came from Chief Chetzamoka of the Sakalam tribe that the Northerners had arrived in several large canoes with an estimated 100 to 200 warriors. Some American settlers had started a lumber mill and village at nearby Port Gamble, where many of the Sakalam worked and were being threatened by the Northerners as well. Both the tribe and the small group of Americans feared the worst. In response, the Massachusetts was sent to intervene. Massachusetts arrived and moored off Port Gamble and sent emissaries to the northern tribe encampment on the shore not far from the mill. Commander Samuel Swartout sent envoys to deliver messages that they would be allowed to leave in peace, and even offered to tow them across the Strait of Juan de Fuca to Vancouver Island. The Northerners responded to each overture with hostility, indicating that they had no intention of leaving. Chetzamoka told Swartout he believed the Northern warriors had already taken some prisoners from nearby tribes, but likely wanted more. And fearful an attack was imminent, he convinced Swartout to take preemptive action, and the following morning the Massachusetts opened fire on the encampment with her cannons and launched a ground force of fighting sailors. The northern tribe returned fire with small arms, but were soon driven to retreat into the woods. The sailors then set about destroying the natives' canoes and provisions. 2 days later, the northern tribe surrendered. During the skirmish, 27 warriors had been killed. The Navy suffered 1 wounded and 1 killed. A sailor named Gustavus Engelbrecht, the first wartime death in the history of the U.S. Navy in the Pacific Theater. The Battle of Port Gamble was over, but Commander Swartout now had a new problem. There were roughly 80 hostile northern Indians in Sakalam lands with no means of getting back home, thanks to the ill-advised decision to destroy their canoes. After burying their dead, the commander took the survivors aboard the Massachusetts and made for Vancouver Island, intending to drop them in Victoria, reasoning that they were likely natives from a British Columbia tribe. The problem of getting them home would be a Canadian one. For the Americans, it was merely a matter of deportation. Upon arrival in Victoria Harbor, the governor of British Columbia, Sir James Douglas, saw things differently. He refused the refugees, and when Captain Swartout threatened to sail up the coast of the island and simply maroon the warriors somewhere on shore, and seeking to avoid an international incident, an accord was reached. The warriors were to be given new canoes and provisioned for their own journey home. I hope you enjoyed that presentation on the Battle of Port Gamble. In case you're wondering, no, it didn't end there. The following summer, the Northern Tribe returned, and what they did had lasting impact on the entire territory and shook everybody to their core. So in the following video, we'll be exploring the events that occurred in August of 1857. We'll learn the identity of that Northern Tribe and exactly where they came from, and also what happened on Whidbey Island in the attack on Eby's Landing. The link to the video is in the description below. We'll see you there.